Good afternoon. My name is Arjun Appadurai. I'm down the road at NYU, but was a happy member of this faculty for several years and continue to be very much involved with social research and the Center for Public Scholarship through my continuing and warm links with Aryan Mack and with her staff and with our colleagues here and beyond. So I'm delighted to be here. This session is called Road Mapping University Development. We will go till about 4, though I gather the morning break was already heavily mortgaged to the life of the mind. But as the hour wanes and as Alan Ryan is in charge of moderating the last session, I want everyone to be as energetic as possible for that one too. So we'll try to stick to the clock, though we're running a bit behind. So let me launch in by saying this is a session that, though it has a general title, I think is intended to ask what the issues of yesterday and this morning might mean and how they play out in other parts of the world. And in this case, we are fortunate to have 3 scholars of great distinction and expertise who will speak respectively about some of these issues in respect to India, China, and South Africa. In that order, I will introduce each of them before their presentations, which will be about 20 minutes each. The first presentation will be about India, and it will be by a colleague who is unable to be here but is able to join us by Skype. So we are part of that great miracle in which Skype meets PowerPoint meets humanity. So Professor Parasuraman, who is our colleague from India, is someone I'm pleased and proud to know very well. He's the director of the Tata Institute for Social Sciences, probably India's oldest and best established social science research institute in Mumbai. I myself have a humble role in its occasional faculty and have seen firsthand what remarkable things are done in Professor Parasuraman's institution. He himself is a sociologist of great distinction who has worked in a variety of fields, including the social study of development, of disaster management, and various other topics of great contemporary importance in India. He's also had a distinguished career in global development organizations such as Oxfam. He serves on a very large number of important committees in both in the state, in the region, and in Delhi, where he is always in demand from the Prime Minister and from many others in India to serve and advise on many matters. His own university is establishing and has established campuses to replicate the Mumbai model in different parts of India, many of which are in out-of-the-way, difficult environments. And so he's in touch with colleagues throughout the country about what higher education actually means, not just at the level of norm, history, tradition, and so on, but where the rubber meets the road in Assam, in rural Maharashtra, in Andhra Pradesh, all of which are places where the Tata Institute has set up a remarkable satellite institutions. I could say a great deal more about Professor Parasuraman, but I don't want to take up the time that is his. I just want to repeat that I'm really very glad that in spite of a very challenging schedule which prevented him at the last minute from joining us, which he fully intended to do, he's able to speak to us today. He also has so he's going to speak to us by Skype and through Skype. At a certain point, I will come up here and do the digital work for his PowerPoint. He's then going to stay throughout the session and be available again on Skype for Q&A. So if you can hear me, Parasu, the floor is yours. You have about 20 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Professor Appadurai, Professor Douglas, Professor Bawa, distinguished participants and dear friends. Very good afternoon to all of you. It's a very early morning to us in India. And I am happy to join you by Skype, though I very much wanted to be there in New York, but there have been situations that I couldn't leave Mumbai. What I would do in this 20 minutes is to present broadly what are the broader challenges facing higher education in India. What are the forward steps that the government of India is planning to take in the 12th five-year plan, which is going to be starting from April 2012. And also to look at how the US universities can be of support in meeting those challenges. India, with its 1.2 billion people and a large young population, is truly a great asset to the nation, which would be still growing in terms of population growth rate even by 2025, and its population would remain youthful for a very long period. So it has a large demographic dividend, but how do you transform this young population into the most productive and educated and productive group is something which we are yet to resolve in this country. Arjun, if you can go to the slide 2. Arjun?
I didn't realize you were going to do this so soon.
India
Okay.
is also...
Shall I put up the first slide, Parasu?
Yeah, you can go to the second one. Yeah, if you look at the gross enrollment ratio, that shows enormous differentials among the social groups. The overall enrollment ratio at this particular point in time at the higher education remains at about 13%, but there is enormous differentials in terms of men and women among the social groups like the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and that is a real problem. And if you go to the next slide, it is far more clearer, where this is what you find. In the age group of 14 and 15, the overall gross enrollment ratio is about 59%. But by 16 and 17, it drops to about 34%. And what remains at the higher education is only about 13%. And that is a problem that a large proportion of our children drop out by the secondary school level itself, and a very small proportion, about 13%, moves to higher education as such. Now, how this proportion of the gross enrollment ratio to be improved is going to be a very important challenge. And the next slide would tell you the level of investment in higher education, public expenditure in India. I think, mind you, until recently, much of the higher education has been in the state sector, mostly funded by the state governments and the federal government. But if you take all the public investments, it's about a small proportion of what other countries spend on higher education, and that's a challenge actually. The next slide will tell you, so the dropout rate between class 1 to 8 is about 43% of the children drop out. And for the classes 1 to 10, it is about 57%. And if you look at the age group of 15 to 29, only about 2% of the young people would have received any formal vocational training. This is in addition to the 13% that gets higher education. And another 8% acquire skills in the workplace. At this particular point in time, new entrants to the workforce is about 12 million every year. And the vocational skills capacity is limited to about 3.1 million. But the trouble is that a large proportion of these trained people are not employable. Inadequacies in our vocational education system poses a serious problem in terms of their employability as such. So, but India is a different country in the sense that the higher education is de-linked from the vocational education. So those who can't get to higher education, those who drop out, a small proportion is able to vocational education as such, but that capability is very limited. And India proposes to train something like about 500 million Indians in vocational education in about next 15 years. And that's a huge target, but one needs to see that how we are going to be achieving that level of vocational education. Broadly, in the next slide, these are the access challenges. That is, we have a very low gross enrollment ratio. We have very few institutions of higher education across the country, and we have something closer to about 300 universities in the country, but of course, several thousand colleges. There are equity gaps that certain ethnic groups have higher enrollment ratio compared to the Dalit and tribal population. The minorities have a very low enrollment ratio. Now, we have not been able to do many demand-side interventions in order to improve, people coming to this educational system. Now, with the increasing penetration of the private sector into higher education, the problem of student financing has to be addressed, actually. Because much of the education, as I told you, is state-funded. But with large number of educational institutions opening up in the private sector, how they are going to be financed is going to be a problem. Mind you, 77% of India's population is either poor or vulnerable. Now, that basically means that for a very large proportion of Indian population, that higher education is not affordable, and there needs to be ways whereby they could be supported to attend the educational system. And of course, there are resource constraints at this particular point in time. But when you look at the quality aspects of it, I think the quality of instruction and research capabilities is relatively poor in many of our state-funded universities, particularly universities funded by the state governments. A vast majority of the students are in poorly funded state universities. Some of the state universities may not have recruited faculty in the last 10 years. And that's primarily because I think the state governments are increasingly underspending or not spending enough in higher education, in supporting their institutions. The quality accreditation is not mandatory. So a very small percentage of institutions and colleges have been accredited by the National Academic Accreditation Council. And that's a problem. And of course, the regulatory regime is highly politicized and bureaucratized in the sense that in the absence of accreditation system, in the absence of a weak regulatory system that is prevalent, I think quality is a casualty in our context. Next slide, Arjun. Arjun, can you go to the next one?
Yet one more.
Yeah. So these are the general concerns which we face. And if you look at the next slide, Arjun?
Yep.
Can you go to another slide?
The next, yeah. Approach to improving higher education.
Yeah, no, okay. I was looking at, the screen is not moving.
Our screen is moving.
Oh, your screen is moving. Then, no, I'm at the slide number 8. I think that is the total spending. Where are you now?
Total domestic intramural expenditure on R&D.
Yeah, so, if you can look at the comparison between the United States and India, I think the level of spend in the research and development is a very small proportion actually. And much of the research in Indian context is located in our laboratories, the state-funded laboratories rather than the university system as such. And if at all, if it is an university system, that is in federal government-funded universities and our IITs, but not in the state-funded universities as such. So that takes us to the issue of now what can be done? What is our 12th plan planning to do? That is the approach to improving education, where the idea is to increase the enrollment of about 10 million students, that is about 3 million more capacity increase for each age cohort. But that's a great challenge. Then also is about improving the quality of education. And of course, bringing in the regulatory apparatus to the focus actually. Now, in terms of improving, the 12th plan focuses on 3 broad areas. One, we are proposing to consolidate good quality institutions in the country. In other words, good quality institutions would be allowed to open up a number of different campuses across the country. And the second approach is to significantly increase the funding to the state-funded, the state government-funded universities as such. So there is a new framework that is being put in place whereby some of the colleges will be improved, it will be upgraded to the status of universities. And the existing state government-funded universities will receive additional funding based on their performance. So the central government is currently working on a framework whereby the state-funded universities, in terms of quality improvement of the teachers, support to the students, the laboratory facilities, and the accommodation for the students and faculty. And these are all issues that are being currently addressed for the state universities as such. Now, some of the critical focused areas is that the percentage of state funding to GDP would have to increase for higher education. It is at this particular point in about 1.2% of the total, GDP, but which we needed to increase it to at least about 2% or 2.5%. But I think the economic downturn in the last few years is not going to provide that level of funding available in the 12th plan, at least in the first 2 or 3 years. Many of the ideas that are in place to improve the quality of education and the access to education may face the financial difficulties in the first 2 or 3 years, but the situation will improve eventually. Now, how can the universities in the United States be of support to the Indian system? If our parliament does work, it has not been doing so for last 2 sessions. There are a number of higher education bills that needed to be cleared. One of them refers to the establishment of foreign universities in India. If that bill gets through, then American universities would be able to set up campuses in India. Now, as I told you, that whether it is private universities or American and European universities setting up in campus in India, the problem is that of how do we provide access to a large proportion of students who come from poor and vulnerable families who would not be in a position to pay for the education. So we have been telling whomever we meet, people coming from the American universities, is that I think India has contributed significantly to American economy through export of our IITians and TCNs and others. And it is time that the American universities come and contribute to improving the quality of education and quality of research in our own universities. That will be a cost-efficient way. Investing in higher education in India is in the interest of the world. Because we have a young population, we have enormous capacity to improve the quality of our teaching and the students. The graduates can be available for the world economy. When everywhere there will be a constraint of young people available for the economy per se. So, to conclude, I would suggest that a few things. One is that the American universities and European universities can join hands with Indian universities to improve the quality of education and engage in collaborative research and to create a conducive environment whereby better quality students and better quality research could be possible in our context. Number 2, I think the privatization of education is not going to be a solution in Indian context, fundamentally because that forms of education becomes unaffordable, and particularly in a situation whereby there are huge inequities in terms of access to higher education. So it may not be viable for the US universities to be able to set up the educational institutions in the country. But if at all they set up, what they would end up doing is to take away better paying students to that universities and leaving poorer quality and poorer students to attend the state government funded universities as such. So these are some of the issues we face, but the challenges are far more greater and far more cooperative action will be needed from all sides in order to improve the quality of higher education in this country. I think I will stop here and wait for other speakers to present, and then I'll come in to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Parasu. I think we've had a few problems towards the end in hearing Professor Parasuraman clearly, but I think the PowerPoint was very helpful in being a guide to his own remarks. So Professor Parasuraman will be with us for the remainder of the session and back, as I say, on Skype to participate in the Q&A. But let me now introduce our second speaker, who is John Douglas. He's a senior research fellow for public policy and higher education at the Center for Studies in Higher Education, CSHE, at the University of California in Berkeley. He has co-edited a book called Globalization's Muse, Universities and Higher Education Systems in a Changing World. He's also the author of The Conditions for Admissions and the California Idea and American Higher Education. He founded and leads the Student Experience in the Research University, SERU Consortium, a group of major research universities in the USA, China, Brazil, and Europe that are developing new data sources and analysis for improving student academic and civic engagement. He is very widely published. He's held visiting positions at Amsterdam University, at the Free University of Amsterdam, at the university in Campinas in Brazil, at Sciences Po in Paris, and at Oxford. He's published also many, many articles in his field of inquiry, and today he will be talking about his understanding of these issues and our broader concerns in the context of China. John?
Let's see if I could get my PowerPoint going. Oops, where's the thing? There we go. So, isn't it amazing the clarity of Skype? But actually, Dr. Parasuraman is right in the back. I saw him. It's behind the curtain. It's a cultural reference you might get. I have three things I want to say. Oh, I see. I've got to get this. Oh, yeah, right. There we go. Before launching it in my talk, and I'll be careful about the time. First, I want to thank Ari and Mac for making me feel so at home, because last night I just felt like it was Berkeley with all the discussions, and it felt really great. The second thing I want to say is that it's kind of nice to go from one state that's really messed up to another state that's really messed up. And although I think our situation is actually worse. And the third is actually a little more serious, and that is I enjoyed the discussion, and I think one thing I just want to add into the mix is not so much in New York, but in other parts of the U.S. and states like California, we're facing really large population growth. You know, we have about 34 million people in California, and we're supposed to grow to 60 million by 2050. So this is a variable that's really important in this discussion about the future of higher education in the United States, because it's not just trying to cope and dealing with things like we are now. It's this larger framework of how we're going to grow these systems to meet access and graduation degree levels and things. It's a gigantic challenge. And final thing to say is I write a fair amount about California's system, and I'm afraid to say that I think educational attainment rates are going down in California, which is really a bad trajectory, especially in an era when usually, when economic downturns occurred, there's greater demand. Well, we can't meet it. We have an estimate of around 250,000 students who couldn't get access to the public system over the last year and a half, 2 years. So in any case, now on to talk about China. I have a fairly provocative title, and I'll not talk about this last part so much, or the subtitle, until I get more at the end, and just kind of give you first a sense. I know many of you know these stories. An incredible story of growth and change in the post-Cultural Revolution era of China. And these are just some facts and figures about what it was like in 1978, roughly the period in which the opening of China's world to the outside world and more market-oriented policies, and a beginning of a major initiative to expand access to higher education, to place it back into or to place it into a central position in economic development and social stability in China. One other interesting little factoid is that University of Peking University had about from what I understand, about 3 graduate students, PhD students in 1980. Okay, it's just decimated any level of kind of graduate programs, and now we have this just huge growth in the attempt to build these programs. And now we're looking at a student population that's roughly about 29 million. The U.S. has about 22, just to give you a sense of how, and it took us, 150 years to get there, right? So, another element, just to kind of give a sense of China in the larger framework of growth throughout the world. It's not just China, but Asia here shown, but China's the big player. You can see the kind of growth rates we've seen between 1990 and 2007. You can also get a general sense, again, a little bit behind on the data, but 2007 to see the proportions of where students are going, what percentage they're taking up of the world, and I think this is an indicator, of course, of that pie chart will change even more. The distribution will be even more heavily in Asia, Africa, and India, of course. So these are, again, these kind of these sense of where China is, where we are in relationship to this really just tremendous growth. I mean, sometimes I get asked, well, what do you do for a living? And I say, well, I work in an industry that is one of the biggest growth industries in the world. I mean, it is a huge growth industry. Industry is a bad word, sorry. It's growth sector, so let's put it that way. So here's just a little more data. You probably have seen this as a little bit dated. I got this out of the New York Times just to show overall growth rates. I think another interesting thing which does model itself in relationship to other developing economies is this heavy emphasis on science and engineering and math fields. I think this is a really important question that hasn't been confronted fully or is just beginning really to be thought about more coherently. Well, if we're going to have comprehensive institutions, what is their makeup in terms of fields? Where are the humanities and social sciences? And frankly, in the past, they've had a very, very low priority in almost any developed economy, and we could see some reasons why. But this is, I think, a conversation that's just beginning to change. In lots of parts of the world, there's talk about and actual activity in developing general education courses or requirements. It's usually experimental and it's small in scale, but I think this is an issue that is very much coming into the framework in places like China. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what is really the latest major planning document that came out of Beijing related to higher education development. It has the not so much fun title, National Outline for Medium and Long-Term Educational Reform and Development, 2010 to 2020, came out about a year and a half ago, something like that. It's otherwise known as the 220 Blueprint. And what I would say about it is that it really is part of a continuum of policymaking in China. It's no major sphere or movement away from a trend that's been growing, and that is a realization in China that they've had a very long period of growth, and now they need to really focus more on the quality of the institutions, kind of a different spot than we perhaps saw with India. And this is, there's a lot of questions about the quality of education, both in terms of how students interact and what they get out of their time in university, and also what the faculty do. I'll return to this shortly. So it is part of this continuum. You perhaps know about the 985 project, which was launched in 1998, and which is this goal that while quality is there's another part of this goal, and that is to have world-class universities, top institutions, the leadership in China, and I think to some degree the leadership among the leading universities, but it is really very much a government-directed approach, is that China must have institutions that rank in the top 50, whatever the number is. Right now, if you do look at rankings, there are a lot of problems with rankings. I'm not a big ranking fan, but it is a benchmark in which governments are looking at these issues. So if you do look at that, you'll find that Tsinghua and Peking University, Beidao, they're all in the 150 to 200 range, according to the Shanghai Jiaotong rankings. And you can look, they're all pretty kind of similar. There's some differences. But this is a big priority for the government and how to get that. Both of these projects, 985, the 211 project, are looking to try to put money into the top institutions that they've identified and make them basically go up in the rankings. So there's a lot of dynamics to that. So about the blueprint, what I would say is, yes, this is the common language of government agencies. We want to build a higher ed, a high-quality national higher ed system. One, I could keep going, that would have institutions that include top-ranked. They're very aware. I think there's a fairly open discussion that they don't have any that rank in the way that the Chinese academic leaders see. There's a quote from the president of Peking University after he left Peking about the fact that China has no top-ranked universities. Just another few, I already said that about where the rankings are. So the blueprint's major goals really lie in two areas, regional distribution and quality, for one. So again, reflecting what we heard about India, there's this significant concern that those universities that are improving in quality are heavily concentrated in the east, along the coast, in the major metropolitan areas. This obviously relates to a much larger socioeconomic reality in China and about how rural areas or the provinces that aren't in the major huge economic development areas, how are they faring, how can they improve that? And the other part is this path to world class. And within that, which has been discussed, there's this concept of having greater autonomy for institutions, yet it's mixed with this very strong concept of accountability and continued, it's really hard to tell the rhetoric of the concept of autonomy versus actual, the long arm of Beijing being so powerful still. So it's a very hard thing to kind of unpack how much is rhetoric, how much is reality. There is some movement towards autonomy, but I think it's very limited. Other things in the blueprint, concept that higher education will continue to expand in order to increase the participation rate, which is about 22% right now of the young age cohort, to eventually 40% is the goal. That still means, though, that there'll be 5 million additional students coming into the system. Greater emphasis than the past will be placed on preschool and adult learning. And as I noted before, the blueprint seeks qualitative improvements in the way that education is done, and that's increasingly focused on not just research productivity, although that's very much a part of it, but how to improve the actual educational experience of students. So, okay, so those are nice things. I want to note something, though, that I think is a perceptive and critical comment by Professor Jia at York University. He is very much a critic, cynic about much of the Chinese higher ed policy, and he says these goals remind me of discussions surrounding the Chinese model or Beijing census. But really, what to look at, or what are those issues that are not being discussed in the actual planning document? And so in my paper, which I will be doing, or have done most of, I go through these kinds of issues that are not mentioned or obliquely mentioned. And I think, again, some of these are known, you hear about them, but one is this urbanization and poverty that we have, that China has significant problems, huge amounts of people coming to the urban areas. China became more urban than rural in the last 5 years or so. This is a transition the U.S. did in 1922, I think, roughly. There's this insatiable demand that relates to a kind of Asian culture about wanting their kids to go on to higher education. So we see that in other parts of Asia, of course, and other parts of the world, but it has a kind of a cultural dimension that is interesting and unique there. And the arrival of unemployment, that the college, overall unemployment is not so bad, But in China, it's about 4.5, I think, are the official numbers. But there's a 25% unemployment rate among college graduates, and this is an issue that is played out in the official press. It's not hidden, and there's these questions of how to line those up. Continuing concerns, as I said, about faculty quality, teaching quality, the race for research productivity. There are lots of demands, or some real problems with plagiarism and evidence of other scandals relating to academic publishing that relates a lot to the pressures being put on faculty to help their institutions go up on the ranking. Joint degrees, I noticed that was one of the things we were supposed to talk about in this meeting, but I would say that if you look at joint degrees, they're very boutique at the moment. They're very small. They get a lot of press, but they're not big players. The one question would be how much they influence the actual practices of institutions in China. I don't think that's really known. The Chinese government is doing a review right now of joint degrees. It may become more critical about that. It also has structural approaches that make sure that Chinese interests and government interests are followed. Leadership and governance, there's this constant discussion about, how strong is the party? The party strength comes in many ways, including control of the actual leadership of the institution. So this is another area that is under discussion. It's not often openly discussed, but these are things that really lie at how can China improve its overall higher ed system. This is just a map, I won't go through this, showing where there are joint programs, and you can see that China has some, but nothing like in the Arab world. And again, if you really look at the overall impact of these programs, I think it's really hard to understand yet how sustainable they are. Yes, there are some that are, then there are some that are not. This is research collaborations. You can see where China is on this side, and you can see that it's actually, if Japan is the brightest spot over there. These are actual joint authorship of articles, and you can see that in this realm, for example, China is limited so far. It's getting better, absolutely. In the years, this is 2005 to 2009, but international interaction in terms of actual joint scholarship is rather limited. I know my time is short, so the last thing I have to say relates to this concept of what are the two really big issues that I think lie ahead for China, and that are not mentioned in the blueprint. One is that thus far, the concerns about quality remained heavily driven by external government policies. And if China is truly to develop world-class universities and higher quality, I would argue that there has to be some kind of a transition in which quality is internally driven by these institutions, in which they have more freedom to actually develop policies that are their own, and that there are other kinds of aspects in which internally driven governance is really important. Another that relates to that is this question of having sufficient levels of academic freedom, and that this is an issue that is very sensitive. I wanted to, on this chart, just to simply show you again the kind of the size and scale. I think these kinds of struggles, though, are not necessarily. I have hope. I think that this is a process that is remarkable in its progress in a 30-year period. And we have to keep in mind that it really is a 30-year period, and that this scale of growth is just a remarkable thing, and there are many, many difficulties to overcome. You know, it wasn't that long ago, to some degree, that we had people being fired or various kinds of controls on speech. Berkeley is a great example of the loyalty oath controversy. So there are these kinds of trends and cultural things that play in, but I do have faith that things will get better. But as I did say, I just want to kind of end with this, is that our research university is simply reflections of the society that gives them life, subject to local cultural and political norms, or are universities leaders of their societies, a place for cutting-edge thought and debate? This is really this underlying question that I think sits below the surface among many academics in China. I hope eventually that will change, and we have to understand the different kind of cultural histories and these kinds of things. But I do think that there is great hope that this will change over time, and it needs to be if China does really want to have world-class universities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, John. Our third and final presentation for this session is by Professor Ahmed Bawa, who is the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Durban Institute of Technology in South Africa. Dr. Bawa is a theoretical physicist who, until August 2010, was a faculty member of the Department of Physics here at Hunter College and a member of the doctoral faculty at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Previously, he held the position of Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Natal and then of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He served and worked at a high level in the Ford Foundation and has also served on a number of policy development teams in South Africa and beyond in the areas of science, technology, and higher education. He has played a role in policy as well as internal university issues for a good long time. And I can say from my own experience with Ahmed that he certainly is a distinguished scientist, but is also hugely interested in the wider social, political, and cultural context within which academic cultures form and either thrive or do not. So it's a great pleasure to have Ahmed Bawa with us. Ahmed?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And I'd like to just begin by thanking Arjun and the advisory board for inviting me here. It's very nice to be back here in New York and to be with friends again. And in the 20 minutes, I thought I'd kind of explore some of the complexities of South African higher education. And I will try and do that, but also just to give you a snapshot, really, of what's going on in South African higher education. I have to constantly remind myself when I come to audiences like this that South Africa is just 17 years into its democracy. We've stopped using the word new South Africa now because it seems like a cop-out, like constantly say the new South Africa. It really is time for us now to begin to think about South Africa as a maturing young democracy. And just the complexities of that democracy are coming to the fore. When we observe what's going on in the Arab Spring, we can just see what's coming. That the hard work is far from over. So, just a snapshot. Here's some numbers: 23 universities, 860,000 students. About 150,000 graduates in 2010. Participation rate is about 17 to 18% of 18 to 24-year-olds. The number of academic staff is about 16,000, and that belies the kind of the complexity of the system, and we can talk about that a little later on. Here's a slightly shocking statistic: only 8% of the total number are master's and doctoral students. International student numbers are about 7% of the total. The target is very much, there's a national target to get that number up to about 10%. The vast majority of those are from other parts of Africa, and in particular from Southern Africa. And the participation in the science and engineering area is about 30%. There's a hope that that will grow to some extent. 56% of the students in the system are women. And I should also then say 44% are men, there's a really big question about what's going on in that amongst the men, young men. 0.7% of the global research output in terms of ISI-type databases and so on emanate from South Africa. And that about 0.5% of the academics of the world are in South Africa. So that's a slightly positive kind of ratio there. And then the race and gender imbalances continue to kind of to characterize the system. Not so much in the student demographics. Student demographics are very different. There's a very close match now to the national demographics there, but there's a deep race and gender imbalances in the academic staff in particular. If you have questions about this, I'll be happy to discuss them with you later. Higher ed remains, however, one of South Africa's most contested ideas, and I want to just, and I'm going to give you a little bit more detail just now, but just to indicate that that there are different representations of this, and one of them is just the fact that there's a constant tension between the national state and the higher education sector. That tension is, of course, partly to do with the fact that the system is heavily subsidized by the state, by the national state. And so there's a view in the state that there should be much more state control over the university. There's an aloofness. The idea of the national state is that the sector is too aloof. It's not really connected with the realities of South Africa. I resonate with that to some extent, and we can have a chat about that. The really big issue is access. Just to give you a sense of the challenge, the university that I'm at the moment, Durban University of Technology, we have 6,000 youth spots every year for first-year students. And this year, for 2011, in 2010, for 2011, we had 70,000 applications. It's a shocking situation. And there's a tremendous pressure on the universities now to move towards vocationalization and so on, and we'll come back, and I'll come back to that in a second. Then there's also contestations within the sector. The HBUs and HWUs, these are very South African terms. They are historically black universities and historically white universities. And although we're in the post-apartheid era now, those tensions still exist. They're not they're not destructive tensions, but they are real tensions to do with distribution of resources and so on. You have to remember that the traditional English universities that were created about 100 years ago. Then there was a second category of universities created around about the 1940s, 50s. These are the Afrikaans universities, white Afrikaans universities. And then in the 60s and 70s, a host of institutions created which are black universities that serve particular communities. So there's a particular university that was designed for Zulu-speaking South Africans, and a particular university for Indian people of Indian origin, and so on. And those were created in the 60s. And of course, the huge disparities, in those two sectors, the HBUs and HWUs. Partly, of course, not partly, mainly because of the history, of course, of funding and so on. Then there's also there's an urban-rural divide. Not all the HBUs are rural universities, but none of the HWUs are rural universities. So there's that, and then there's the split, between those universities that see themselves as primarily research universities, and those that are seen as primarily teaching universities. I have to say, though, that the strongest research university is the University of Cape Town, but only, I think the figure is something like 17% of University of Cape Town, 17% of the students at the University of Cape Town are master's and doctoral students. So it's by no means a research-intensive university, but it has a very strong research base. And of course, through all of that, there's a race overlay, right? Which is that, the HBUs continue to be heavily biased in terms of their demographics towards black students. Urban, rural, same story. And research and teaching, same story. So there's a kind of a race overlay. And that's something that continues in this context. And regularly at some universities, including mine, there are student actions which continue. This is very much a sort of a South African tradition, like this. It seems as though it's in our genes, like to struggle. I have to say that from time to time it's a bit of an irritation, but the fact of the matter is that students grow enormously through this process, so I don't mind it so much. But the key issues really are financial aid, student accommodation issues. But perhaps the main driver of this is just the dynamics within student politics in South Africa. And by the way, the students all belong to the single mother party, which is the African National Congress, but different branches of different formations within the ANC. And that plays itself out in student politics. This is just an indication of some sort of, this diagram has sort of changed slightly now since, unfortunately it was done on Apple, so whenever you do an Apple PC switch, you get this kind of, so just think of this as internal to the system in the middle there, at the bottom at least, and external at the top there, and working its way through, there. We have a totally dysfunctional school system. Of course, we have elite schools which function very well, but under any form of scrutiny, the school system is dysfunctional. And I have to say to you that there's no possibility of South African universities saying we need better students, because those are the only students that are being produced by the higher education system, by the school system at least. And really, the question really is how do we manage it? There's no possibility of, the interventions going on, but the interventions aren't having the kind of effect that we would like. So it's a big issue. There's a really big issue about social compact. I'm going to come back to that a little later on. There isn't really a social compact in South Africa relating to the way in which the university and the state and the business sector and so on fit together. That's something that we'll talk about. I'll come back to that. The regulatory framework in South Africa is very well established. We have a Ministry of Higher Education. We have a very substantial Department of Higher Education which kind of does all the administrative stuff. Then academic freedom and institutional autonomy are entrenched in the constitution of the country. That has its own problems, and can talk about that a little later on. We have a higher education quality operation, which resides within something called the Council of Higher Education. And this is every university undergoes a five-year review. The professions all have reviews and so on, so the quality system is fairly well established. There's an organization of vice-chancellors called HISA, the Higher Education South Africa, which has regular meetings with the ministry and so on. So there's a fairly substantial regulatory framework which kind of exists. And there's a tension that emerges in that regulatory framework around the issue of institutional autonomy. And there's a euphemism that has emerged now that the higher education system is steered by the government. There's a steering mechanism, but that the government is not supposed to interfere in the universities, but it can steer it because, of course, it contributes a very substantial amount of the money to. On the demand side, the really critical issue is access. As I said earlier, 17% of 18 to 24-year-olds currently are in the higher education system. And the target is to get that figure up to 30%. The problem is that there's just no capacity in the universities to take up those numbers. So, what's the answer to that? And I'll come to that in a short while. There's a huge emphasis on skills development, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Higher education funding is fairly secure. There's a kind of a 5-year plan, a rolling 5-year plan which gets announced, and that 5-year plan indicates to universities what the commitment of the government is. So it helps for planning and so on. There's a serious disarticulation issue. And I want to, I'll come to that, so it's 5 minutes left. So. Financial aid, of course, is a big issue. And in this middle sector, the really big issue around sustainability is the production of doctoral graduates. We're just not producing enough doctoral graduates. The annual production at the moment is something like 1,200 doctorates a year, and it's just nowhere near enough what we need. This diagram here is really to indicate to you that we have this very odd situation in South Africa, that if you look at this diagram, you'll see that there are just too few students in the college sector compared to the university sector. And that really we have to invert this pyramid, in fact. And that's going to be one way in which we get to this 30% level, if you like, of enrollments. In other words, to say that we have to grow something like a community college sector. We have something called an FET sector, further education and training college sector. And that's very small at the moment. So there's a very big challenge in trying to understand how to write this pyramid. And that's something that's very much on the agenda now. This slide is really about the disarticulation. And, while South Africa was the first country to do the heart transplant, and various other sort of very substantial technological advances and so on, we are 123rd on the Human Development Index. It's a shocking statistic, really. And it's not because we're a poor country. It's got to do with the fact that the history of the Gini coefficient is the highest in the world now. The distribution gap, the wealth distribution gap is the largest in the world. And there are a range of issues around the disarticulation. The first one is just the fact that the research and innovation system isn't really driving research agendas which have to do with with the big challenge. We still have cholera in South Africa. Of course, HIV/AIDS is an absolutely staggering challenge for us and so on. So I'm not going to spend too much time, but just to say, the three broad areas. The one is the area of research and innovation, not connecting with the needs of South Africa. Then the whole issue around curriculum renewal. Nation building is a very big challenge for us. And as I said earlier, the whole issue around underpreparedness is a big issue. The nation building issue is a big challenge for many reasons. And one of them, of course, is the fact that we have this very substantial race overlay, which has to be dealt with. And the tragedy is that the paradigm that we've used for nation building continues to draw on a race-based kind of imagination. So it's, affirmative action is a very big thing, and black economic empowerment and so on. So instead of taking an anti-racial approach, we've adopted a non-racial approach, which is a very different kind of conceptual framework. And then the whole issue around engagement between the universities and the government and industry and so on leaves something to be desired. So what I wanted to say really was that South Africa has gone through, in the 17 years, we've gone through a series of national imaginations, and I'm not going to go into them in any detail. So I'm just going to mention them because the time has run out. But we had the Reconstruction and Development Program, which was there was a national consensus on this. It was a radical program. This was in 1992 to 1994, leading up to the elections the first elections in 1994. That was abandoned very soon afterwards to a program which is called GEAR. And GEAR stands for Growth, Employment, and Reconstruction. But in fact, it was a kind of a neoliberal imagination that was introduced. It kind of, it put the knowledge economy right in the center, built up this notion of building a high-class research universities which were going to contribute to, and so on. Very much a focus on science, engineering, and technology. But built into GEAR was a kind of a self-inflicted structural adjustment program. And the result is, in fact, that we've got a smashed health system, a smashed education, primary school and secondary school education system and so on. The third one was, just a recent one, in fact, is this, we've now gone into another phase, which is this labor-intensive growth phase. Suddenly, unemployment has become the key factor now. 25% is the official unemployment figure. The actual figure is something like 50%, 46, 47%. So now we're shifting into a labor-intensive growth. Each of these imaginations, by the way, had huge implications in terms of the way universities were funded and research was funded and so on. And each one of them over the last 14 years has shifted things dramatically. So the universities are kind of floundering to some extent. I mentioned nation building already. That's a big issue. We've done well, I think, in the 17 years, but we have a long way to go. The last President Thabo Mbeki, had this wonderful notion of the African Renaissance. It was really a way of thinking about a post-colonial construction of the new South Africa, how we would enter the global community, but on the basis of a rediscovery of our African roots and our Africanness. And then, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation process, which was hugely important for South Africa, but it came at a cost. We had this wonderful kind of commitment to reconciliation, but it came at a cost. The cost was that there's this very strong view, in fact, in many, many quarters, that it eroded our commitment to justice, and that had its. So just to say that each of these imaginations had its kind of implications on the way in which the universities thought about themselves, and so on. So what I wanted to say was, we obviously have a functioning higher education system. It does well, but we've got a long way to go. The demand side is that the pressures on the demand side are absolutely staggering, and there's going to be a big question about that in the next 4 or 5 years, I would say. So we have these shifting imaginations, shifting pressures that they bring to bear. We have these shifting funding paradigms, and at the moment there's just no possibility of a coherent social compact because things are shifting so rapidly. And I suppose in retrospect we have to say that we need time. We need time. The nation needs time. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks to all three of our speakers. I hope Professor Parasuraman will be downloaded to us again. That was the plan. Hi, Parasu.
Hi, Arjun.
We have just concluded the three presentations. I think you were able to hear them.
Of course.
All very excellent and informative and provocative. We have about little over 15 minutes, not very much time, so I was going to suggest, if the three of you were willing, that we would take a few questions or comments or reactions which could be addressed to one or all of you, and then that in the order we spoke, each of you could respond to anything you like, rather than have a back and forth which will become difficult. So I don't know whether we have mics. Oh, good. So Lisa is closest to the front mic. I'm sure that puts you in a good position, Lisa. It's good to see you, by the way. Not to put pressure on you, though. Do we have, if there are no immediate or urgent questions, we can also ask if, there are, lovely, good, please. And if you could all introduce yourselves briefly.
Yes, this is MP Prabhakaran, an alumnus of the New School. My question is for Dr. Parasuraman. First, this preface. I have a sentimental attachment to your name because I come from that state in India which, according to Hindu mythology, was created by your namesake. Now, back to the question. You touch upon the latest trend in American and European universities of starting faculty campuses abroad. In countries like Saudi Arabia or some Middle Eastern countries where there's a dearth of scholars and a kind of lack of culture of higher education, it is absolutely necessary and welcome. But in India, where there is an abundance of scholars and the culture of higher education is more than what you can handle, higher than what you can handle, is there any need for that? And what is the motive behind that? To make money or spread education? If it's a question of giving Eurocentric or US-centric education, you can start a chair and some rich people or even vested interest will finance those chairs. So what is the purpose in bringing campuses for American universities and European universities?
Thank you. We have time for a few more questions, observations. Yes, please.
Just a quick question for...
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Ian Rios. Quick question for John Douglas. In regards to Chinese universities, you brought up how Beijing has the long arm that pretty much centralizes change. Earlier today, we talked a little bit about how a lot of administrative positions at universities have been created by student need for other programming and things like that. How much of changes within universities in China are affected by students really pushing for these changes? Is that existent? Is that non-existent?
Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Amy Chen. I'm wondering, over the last night and today, we've talked about how students in America aren't college ready when they get to college. Do you see this problem in your countries that you're studying?
Thank you. Please.
Brian Alexander, National Institute for Technology and Liberal Education. And I'm wondering if all of you could speak to the role of open content and open access scholarship in your different national strategies for higher education. Thank you.
Brilliantly concise questions, which therefore leave time for a few more, if anybody is so inclined. While you're thinking about whether you want to come up, I'll use the airtime to just slide a thought in myself, that in addition to the fascinating demographic and numerical information that itself is worthy of a lot of thought, I couldn't help thinking at one level how nice it would be for these systems to have the problems that many American universities face. And on the other hand, how nice it would be for the US if these were the problems this system faced, when you're thinking of things like outrageous pricing, which is obviously a major popular issue with education. Its expensiveness, that somehow doesn't seem quite central to what's happening here. A radical absence of the whole community college level in South Africa, stunning fact, so that the top part of the system has to function as the lower part of the university system, the city system does in New York. That is, basically the whole country is a remedial system in that sense, which is then astonishing disadvantage, so to speak. So there are some stunning, it seems to me, interesting, consequential things. And of course, the Chinese case, to my mind, this just to state almost the obvious, raises this question, the numbers question. In other words, how can what Ian Hacking called the avalanche of numbers be somehow transformed into questions about quality? It almost seems as if the number question in China itself precludes the quality question, not because they aren't smart people, but because the aggregate numbers are so massive that infusing quality into them is very difficult. As far as India is concerned, Parasu's fascinating observation about a place that I also spend time in and have a great interest in is something which could be asked of all these places, which is the big official thrust to global competitiveness and so on and so forth. Where does it leave the systems which have massive problems, as it were, at the base? That's the common question, I would say, including in China. where rural poverty and so on is remarkable. But this gentleman is ready, so please. Oh, yes, yeah. Two more, and then we'll let you and yourself, and then we'll have our colleagues respond. Yeah.
My name is Ava Zeiter, and I have a question for Professor Parasuraman. And my question is, there's been a lot of press about the capability of graduates coming out of engineering schools in India. And I'm just wondering, I guess some industries have chosen to provide education, within their company sector, and I'm just wondering if you can add a little bit or expand on that, and also explain how India might be trying to foster innovation in the engineering field.
Thank you. Sir.
Claude Taylor, Monmouth University, New Jersey. So this question's for the panel, and it's a question about rhetoric and or discourse around growth of higher education. To what extent has the rhetoric or discourse around higher education development in the respective countries been about progress or social mobility to a middle class? And so is that part of the discourse, part of the rhetoric, or is there a different kind of vision for progress and development of higher education institutions in these countries? Thank you.
Excellent question with which to frame some of the others. So maybe we'll go in the order that we did before and ask Professor Parasuraman for his reactions, and we'll go on to John Douglas and Ahmed Bawa.
Thanks, Arjun. Thanks for this very important and interesting questions. First of all, India's problem is like that of the China and South Africa, where, of course, particularly in relation to China, that a massive number of young people need higher education, and the question of how can the quality of education and access to education can be improved. But certainly, there has been progress that has been achieved in the last few years, whereby disadvantaged communities are increasingly getting access to higher education, and Indian affirmative action, particularly to other backward castes, has made it possible for a larger number of otherwise disadvantaged communities to be able to access higher education. And in the new context, it is making difference to people. I think, in that way, there has been positive developments in terms of changing condition of people at all levels, actually. Those who get access to better quality higher education have been able to improve their quality of life. But the mushrooming of the technical institutions in the last few years meant that very many substandard technical institutions have come into existence, and they produce graduates in engineering. Quite a good proportion of them are not employable, actually. So, of course, many of our software companies have in-house training system that these candidates who would be eventually selected needed to go through a long training and capacity building in order to be able to deliver the goods, actually. So as I was telling in my presentation, the major problem is of regulatory authorities and able to provide quality education through those processes. Now that relates to the first questioner. India doesn't have abundant teacher population, actually. In fact, it is about the quality of teachers who are available in our university system, actually. Because there are a number of centrally funded educational institutions that were set up recently, I think many of the good teachers from the colleges and state government funded institutions have been migrating to those institutions, thereby exposing the inadequacies of the neglected institutions in the country, actually. So we face enormous difficulties in recruiting quality teachers which is a problem actually. And we don't produce enough PhDs, and we don't produce enough good PhDs actually in both science and social sciences. And innovation in engineering, of course, is limited fundamentally because we are mostly focused on education rather than research, including our IITs. I think the focus is on creating engineers and technologists rather than creating researchers. And if our IITs are not doing that kind of good work in research, then we can't expect from our state universities and the private engineering colleges. So innovation in engineering is limited, and that is the thrust of the 12th five-year plan in the country that needed to be established. So one of the options is to make a open access to content. I think many of our IITs have made their content available, which can be accessed by varying universities and engineering colleges and technology institutions freely. I think we are currently in the process of networking all our universities so that the open courseware could be available to all institutions actually. So that's a big thrust towards reaching a quality curriculum to institutions spread across the country. But the challenge is that those institutions do need people who can coach, who can mediate that learning process as such. So now, of course, the foreign universities, if they are going to come to India, they are not going to be very different from the private universities, actually. So I think India is not a place where education can be seen as a business, fundamentally because of the social composition and the income inequalities and other inequalities that we have in our country, that education needed to remain in the state sector. Education needed to be supported to an extent whereby a good proportion of children are not denied access to higher education as such. So this is where we are. There are moves, but then resources needed to be provided in order that educational quality can be improved. But I think it's a long way to go. We want to improve the gross enrollment ratio to about 20-22% by the end of the 12th plan, that is 2017. But it is possible to expand access, but then, enhancing quality and providing quality education is going to be a challenge. I think there is quite a lot of discussion that is happening around here, but I think this is where American universities can really support India in the sense that come and work with us, and that would be a better way to spread education, and that way we would be able to supply more better educated scholars and scientists to the United States, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Parasuraman. John Douglas, would you like to come up here or speak from there?
Okay. So, good questions, interesting questions. So, what I would say is on students pushing for change generally, there's a lot of tension in this issue, of course, in relationship to Tiananmen Square and the role of students. And I think that's an important kind of overall, there is residue from that and student behaviors, perhaps. But if you were to then look at the other issues relating to students' behaviors, I think there's a very strong understanding or sense that Chinese culture, the Confucius culture of harmony, of hierarchy, has a big influence on student behavior in universities. And it's an issue that sits there that I think most universities or the leadership is trying to see how to untap those students to some degree, to make them more active, and the faculty need to teach in that way as well. So this is a big issue, how to get students to be perhaps more active and less subservient in the process of learning. And there's a sense of tremendous untapped latent talent in the Chinese population. So this is a big issue, and so I would say if you look at most behaviors of Chinese universities, that the students aren't leaders of change in terms of their internal processes, but there's a desire to change that. And this gets to the other part about are students ready for higher education? In many parts of the world, including China, decisions about readiness are determined by a single national test. And these are very narrow concepts of intelligence. There's, I think, growing understanding of this to some degree, but it's also understood whether it's in Brazil or whether it's in China or in Japan, is that a single national test is also seen as an equitable way of providing access, this relates a bit to the question about socioeconomic mobility. So it's a very difficult issue to overcome and change. But what I would say is that most research that we know of, and it doesn't necessarily all match up culturally, is that single national tests are not necessarily good indicators of overall readiness for college and how their behavior patterns once they're in college. So I think the students obviously are going to these institutions are extremely bright, but there's some limitations that they face, and I think this is an issue that's being understood to some degree among leaders of China's higher education systems, many of which having experience in other parts of the world now. And then the only other thing I want to add, so to get to Ahmed, is that this lack of other kinds of institutions like like community colleges, is also a big issue in China, in that there's this kind of expectation by parents, by students, that they must go to university, that this is critical for their overall life chances. And there are vocational programs, there are private institutions. They tend to be very small. There's a fair amount of them, just like the U.S., but they actually they enroll, not as big in numbers as you might expect. And so there is this real need for other kinds of institutional types. But wrapped into that is you have to have cultural acceptance of those institutions as a viable path. And so there's those two issues, I think, are there in China, but in other parts of the world as well.
Thank you very much, John. Ahmed, Bawa.
Thank you so much. Well, in terms of student activism, it's almost, as I said earlier, it's almost a sort of a genetic phenomenon in South Africa. Students are just naturally kind of predisposed to taking up issues, and it's actually quite an interesting phenomenon, and it does keep the university administrators on their toes, I have to say. On the other hand, it's also from time to time very kind of debilitating, because it kind of really grinds things to a halt. And so, but yeah, it's something that's still very much in the culture of South Africa to take on issues, to kind of really feel free to march and whatever. In terms of college readiness, we do very badly. South Africa does extraordinarily badly, and that's a very big issue. Just to give you one hint of the difficulties we have, in the province that my university is in, KwaZulu-Natal, at the moment we have a teacher attrition rate of 4,500 a year, and the universities produce just 1,800 teachers a year. So we have this dramatic kind of challenge of trying to understand how to accelerate the production of teachers to make up this. Now, you might ask, what's going on? Well, it's HIV/AIDS. People are dying. People are getting too sick. Teachers are getting too sick, or people are going to better jobs, non-teaching jobs. So that's just a hint of the difficulties that we face there. And of course, as Arjun was saying, the fact that we don't have a decent college sector means that the load is then shifted to the universities to try to, and I think that we just have to understand, the universities have to understand that there aren't any other students. These are the students we have. And by the way, these are the elites, because they've really graduated through that pathetic school system, and somehow you have to get them to develop and grow and so on, in the time that they are at university. It's a massive challenge, massive difficulties. In terms of the open access, did you mean open access or did you mean open source?
Open access scholarship.
Open access scholarship. There are activist groups on each of the universities, and they very, very active activist groups. So, at the moment there's no national kind of approach to this, but there are regular meetings and so on, and there's a week, an open access week that's held every year where there are national meetings, meetings take place nationally and so on. I think your question about mobility towards the middle class, again, I'll just refer to my university. About 90% of the students that come to my university are first-time learners, first-time higher education learners. Nobody else in their families has ever been to university before. These young people know that this is their one chance of getting into a decent job, into a decent, in a situation where the unemployment rate runs at about 40%, unofficial unemployment rate runs at about 40%. The university education is the one thing that they understand. Gives them the. It's a very powerful kind of engine, if you like, to get that forces young people into higher education. And I mentioned this issue around, there's this deep concern about what's happening to young men. Why is it that they're dropping out at such a high rate? And I think it's a really serious question, because it's also a very violent society, and and much of the violence is actually perpetrated by young men. So it's a very big question.
Well, we're running a bit over time, so let me thank each of our contributors and our commentators and all of you in the audience. I think we reconvene after a short coffee break promptly at 4:28 or so that you can start at 4:30. Thank you all.